It's not true about everyone, but some people later in life feel more set in their opinions and they don't want somebody else to try and share a different perspective. Especially maybe there's other people in their lives who are trying to help them see something different and they just want that validation.
Welcome to the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. This episode is sponsored by the Collab Oasis Clinical Consultation Groups. Hi, I'm Jeanene Wolf, and I'm your colleague down the hall. I have a passion for helping fellow therapists get the clinical and collegial support we all need to do this work. And wow, it just keeps getting harder every day. I'm the founder and facilitator of the Collab Oasis Clinical Consultation Groups. I have been a social worker for almost 30 years, and I own a successful solo online private practice. More of us than ever are practicing in solo or online practices, and we all need colleagues to process cases with, commiserate with on those really hard days, and also to celebrate our successes with. In this podcast, I'll bring you insights about trends and changes in our field and sit down with amazing therapists who are doing amazing work. We'll discuss fictionalized cases, ways to practice sustainably, and of course, there will be plenty of laughing. I love laughing with friends. I'm so glad to have you as one of my colleagues down the hall. Hello, everyone. You are listening to another episode of the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. I am your host, Jeanene Wolf, joined today by a group of colleagues to discuss a fictionalized case. Listen in as we look at various aspects of the case, along with treatment recommendations, areas of concern, and ways to look at those gray areas we often encounter in our field.
So Joe is a 72-year-old widowed male. He lives alone and does not have much support from his family. He doesn't feel comfortable driving and spends much of his day watching cable news. Recent events in the country have become politically polarizing, and Joe adamantly expresses views which directly oppose the identity and rights of the therapist. The therapist has been working with Joe for a number of years, but is finding it increasingly difficult to remain neutral, to hold space for Joe, or redirect these discussions to more therapeutically relevant topics. Joe, though, has expressed a need to discuss these current political issues as part of his treatment. The therapist wants to refer Joe out to someone who can better support his needs around his political views, but also for the therapist's own well-being. So Michelle is coming to us today to talk about thoughts on referring out, and there's so many complexities in this case. And this is something that I think as therapists, we're seeing more and more things come up. So let's get it started. Does anyone have any questions, first of all, about the case? Okay, and just so you know, everyone is welcome to unmute themselves. You don't have to raise your hand. We will just sort of jump in and talk as a group. So if somebody who has a harder time jumping in and collaborating because they're more of an introvert, you want to raise your hand, I'm happy to make sure you get some space to talk. But we can all just go ahead and start sharing our thoughts. So the question being is it okay for Michelle to be considering referring this client out? Let's start there. What are people's thoughts on that?
I was just going to ask Michelle, what is it that is different for you in terms of, whatever he's disclosing in therapy? What are you feeling that you're not aligned with that's bothering you?
I feel like he wants to focus on the messages he's hearing as given to him. And it seems like he's looking or wanting or searching for validation from me that I agree with these things. And because, number one, I'm personally leftist, but try to not put that into therapy at all.
Mm-hmm.
I also am fairly well read from a variety of sources, so we've had some discussion, but it felt like it was getting more into argument instead of trying to support where he's coming from. And I'm finding a struggle in leaving space to validate these are his beliefs while not like repeatedly. Like this is what he wants to do every week. And we're not really getting into it. I've been trying to move it into more therapeutic like, how does this impact you? Do you have support with this? That kind of stuff. And it feels like he's using me as he would like a friend, that he could chew the fat over these beliefs. And he's not been very open to exploring other sources. So I'm kind of stuck as to what to do with that. And, 98% of what he's talking about is the opposite of how I feel. So after a number of months, it's getting very hard because we're not moving anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. And Michelle, I imagine much like most of us are trained to kind of, we have to be this blank slate. It's getting harder and harder in our world to do that, and to be able to show up in a supportive way therapeutically for clients when there are so many different things happening in our world that can be polarizing.
Well, and I think that, I have other clients that I'm fairly sure have fairly different views, and I've been able to touch on how that's impacting them and help them work on what they want to do to lessen that impact or get support. And that has worked for a lot of people. And it just seems like he's more wanting to get agreement. And I'm struggling. I can validate that these are his thoughts. It's also hitting some of it's a lot of pressure to keep.
Sure. Yeah. Well, yes. And I would imagine your own emotional and mental well-being is being impacted by this as well, when you are maybe going into the session feeling tense about what's going to be discussed and those types of things. But let me turn to Andrea. Did you have a question, Andrea, or something you wanted to say?
No, I was just kind of going to validate Michelle in this struggle, because it is difficult. And I think, like you mentioned, Jeanene, we as therapists were taught to sort of be that blank slate and that kind of meet clients where they're at and things like that. And I think that it's important for us to be there for ourselves and each other as humans before just therapists, and that can only take us so far. We can, be, like you said, Michelle, certain clients, you can hear their perspective and validate their feelings. And okay, how does this relate to where we want to go with treatment? Versus that same, almost like a broken record, repetitive over and over. And that can get really draining, especially when it's so different from where you're coming from as a person.
Yeah. And I feel like too, sometimes validating, okay, this is your experience and how does that works for a lot of people. And I think sometimes some people are gonna keep poking you until you say you agree with what they're saying. And that's the feeling I'm getting here, is he's wanting agreement. And we've talked about, it's not up to me to agree. You have your own, but he's not letting that go. He really wants to be validated in the way of agreeing with him and seeing that response. And I've danced around it every way I can without saying I don't agree.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what to do. That would be beneficial.
Yeah. Well, Michelle, it sounds like you've done a really good job of assessing why he's different than some of your other clients, and that why this is pushing a different threshold than your other clients are. And so the question you're bringing to the group is, can I refer out for my own well-being, but also the well-being of the client, who can be served better by someone who might be able to be supportive in the way that he's asking you to be?
Yeah, because I feel like what he's looking for, I can't deliver. And but my other concern is I've seen him for a while and he doesn't have a lot of family support. So I'm concerned about that too.
Sure. Absolutely.
And it sounds like maybe considering, because he's 72 years old. So,
yeah,
at that age, in my experience anyway, I don't want to say everyone is set in their ways by that age, but, they live so long, and a lot of times their views they hold tight and sound in their views. And so, and to be honest, when we're talking about referring out, I think us therapists, we get so boggled down with every little thing that we're potentially or perceived supposed to do. It's just absolutely kind of nuts to me sometimes.
It can be too much, yes.
It's a little bit much. And so, at the end of the day, at the very end of the day, if you really, I feel, in my opinion, that if it's really bothering you, if it's a struggle, not only that, the validation seems to be that he has to have you to agree with him. And on top of that, you're really not even aligned with those views and perceptions and going on and going on. I would maybe consider how to refer in a safe way, obviously, look at all the options, because ultimately we're not doing anybody a service if it's interfering with that. And in my opinion, I don't really feel that it's a bad thing if you had to refer out because of that. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Andy, were you wanting to say something?
Yeah, I was going to be looking back at Joe's treatment goals and look at what the treatment goals are and see if it's political that he's looking for, if he's looking for some kind of political identification. And before we refer out, looking at, is there some place in the community for resources that he can go to, like a political action coalition, to garner that support rather than from the therapist? And also, he's spending a lot of his time watching TV. Are there other things that we could help him do to form an identity outside of political?
Yeah, great
to help him form more relationships with other people. That way, he's not so focused on the political side of things.
Absolutely.
I'd expand on that by just going back to my original goals with him, like try to refocus him and say, let's go back and look at your goals, and maybe that would help get them off the track of politics. And I'm usually pretty upfront and say to a client that, especially if they're using insurance, we're here for a medical reason, and I want to stay on track with how I can really best assist you. Perhaps talking about politics isn't the best way I can assist you, and just see if they really do go with me, and without being too abrupt or too trying to soften, saying this is not where I want to spend my time in our therapy sessions.
Yeah, great points. Heidi, did you want to say something?
Yeah, so in response to the question of can the therapist, or should the therapist refer out, or can the therapist refer out? My answer to that is absolutely. I kind of connect to it. Well, one, I agree with Andy in that, like, what's underneath this? Because I don't think it's necessarily about the political affiliation, but more so loneliness and isolation and needing somewhere to belong. So he's been in therapy for several years, and I don't think we know the diagnosis or the goals. So to me, I would wonder if he's in therapy just to have somebody to vent to talk to. And then, so yes, absolutely. I look at referring out if I don't feel like I'm the best therapist for the client. And usually that is if there's no progress being made, or if that client's needs aren't being met. But I think too, I have to be careful that I'm not assuming whether or not that client's needs are being met. And then also looking what's underneath that. So I think there's a lot of action that can be taken here before he's referred out. But I know that there's a lot of limitations with him not being able to drive. But I think he's using therapy as a support network in a way. So being able to fill a support network otherwise adjacent to therapy might be important to recognize too.
Yeah, I think when I was reading this, I'm kind of looking at, if it's been a few years, I kind of went with the assumption that all of those things had been tried, and really what it's coming down to is want someone to talk to, and this is into, so this is what he wants to talk about. And because I think at first, you're always going to want to try, obviously with the no support, you're going to want to try and find other avenues for him to get support, maybe investigate some other groups or other people his age, all that kind of stuff. But I think some people, like again, like what you were saying, what their need is I think sometimes they need, especially when you get with older people that are a little more set, like they need you to agree with them to feel like then they can like maybe listen to suggestions you have.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's true with everyone, but I do think it's important to recognize if something like this, it feels to me like this might be getting in the way of actually having a deeper therapeutic alliance and feeling trusted by
Mm-hmm.
them. And so I know that sometimes that can really get in the way. And then if someone's like, well, this person's not, it's seeming like this person's not on the same page with me with everything, why am I going to listen to any advice they give me?
Great point. Trust. Yeah. You may be looking for somebody to align with, to trust, to get deeper. That makes sense.
Yeah. And we all know that we can build trust and not necessarily share beliefs, but I think some people don't feel that way, and they're never going to buy into the I'm here for you on this level. They're just never going to get there, especially, older people haven't had a lot of therapy, just haven't had a lot of,
Yeah. And somebody made the point earlier that it's not true about everyone, but some people later in life feel more set in their opinions, and they don't want somebody else to try and share a different perspective. Especially maybe there's other people in their lives who are trying to help them see something different, and they just want that validation. And when working with seniors, we're looking at a developmental phase where they're now looking more towards the last part of their life and maybe reflecting on their life as a whole and their own mortality. And so then that's the trust issue comes in really hugely there, because we know that there's a higher incidence of depression in seniors. And so we need for this person to trust us so that we can give them the support that they need to, either if they're having depression or, potentially going to experience it, we can do the therapeutic work to be helpful in that way.
I was going to say, I think that idea of really being able to trust and align and agree with someone is important for some clients more than others. And obviously we as therapists have the skills and the ability, not that other people don't, but to, hold that space for, okay, I don't totally align with you. However, I can meet you where you are and work with you through this thing. But if for a client that's a really important piece that's missing, it's going to prevent real progress and real growth and change from happening. And so I think that's kind of a further or another point in the argument, so to speak, of why you could and potentially should refer out, because perhaps he can find that type of relationship and what he's really looking for with a different therapist.
Yeah, such great points, everyone. Michelle, do you have any more thoughts that you want to share, or any questions you want to ask of the group? Because then if you make the decision to refer out, now the next step is managing the referral so that it's appropriate and the client feels taken care of and not abandoned. That's when there's another sort of difficult part that you have to manage with that as well. Do you have any questions about any of that?
I guess I would just throw it out there too. Like my first guess would what I would do is I would just discuss his, it says he's expressed a need to discuss it as part of his treatment. And I would discuss where he feels that's going to be important for his treatment.
Yeah.
And then, at that point, I would probably discuss, that's not something I can do, and validate his desire for that. And then discuss, because I think too, if he's saying, I really need this, and I'm saying, I get that, and that's valid, very valid, but that's not something I can do, and having that conversation and seeing what they are. Maybe one of two things I'm hoping would happen is either, because I would have to say that's not on the plate. I can't just sit here and agree with every option you throw at me, because that wouldn't really be therapy anyway. And if that's something that's important to you, we want to get you to someone who can actually give that to you. And then it allows him to actually decide what does he really want to do. It gives he's got two options. He's going to be like, I can get back into discussing therapy goals, and we can talk about, maybe there's some other outlets you can talk about that specifically with, and we can work on these other things. But if that doesn't work for you, that's valid. But then there's your other options. So you're giving him, so he's going to have to decide. Okay, I want to stay with you because I've been with you for a few years and I'm comfortable with you. So, and we can work on how do you get that need met somewhere else. I mean, I guess you would kind of do that with a lot of things, even if it's not politics, is you're trying to get this need met through me, and that's not really a therapist need. We can talk about it, we can support it, but really we want to figure out how to get that need met in your environment. And if he doesn't want to do that, that's okay, but then he's making the decision that he's going to try someone else.
Yeah, such a great point.
But yeah, there is concerns. Obviously, he's older and change, and if you've been working with him for a few years, that's tough.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know.
Does anyone else have any thoughts or questions or any aspects of this case that, you know, because we can do a tangent if someone's like, okay, well, let's go out, let's turn right on this case because I'm wondering about this. So if you have anything like that you want to know how we would progress with maybe a similar case, please feel free to speak up.
I mean, my only thoughts about, and this has nothing kind of to do with the case, it's just the thought of having to maybe decide to refer out. And of course, always do it in the safe way and doing all of this. But why are we as therapists it almost feels like we are not allowed to say, this case is not for me.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's not, we don't have to be, we're not right for everybody, and everybody's not for us. And things will come up in therapy. And I've had, you know, and I am no perfect like at all. Okay. But I just feel like there's this like tone with us that we can't decide. We're always going to do what's best for the client. But if we feel some type of way internally that is very significant, then I feel we have every right to refer out appropriately.
Absolutely. And I think that this goes back to most of the time with our training, we were taught how to be objective and be supportive. And there wasn't a lot of discussion about what if this is backing up against your own needs or your own rights. And this is, you know, your well-being is being impacted here. And so referring out is not something that a lot of us had good training on as far as what are the situations where we can do this. And even if you talk to a group of therapists, you're going to have some people who say, absolutely, it's my job to stay neutral and give them what they want. But I think our world is getting more complicated, and we have to start evolving as clinicians to recognize that we can't always do that. And the pandemic was a game changer. For the first time ever, we are all living through what our clients are all living through. And that has taken a toll, and the burnout is tremendous. And so it's such a good point. Like we need to be able to take ownership of the fact that I need to look at this for my own well-being, but also all my other clients. If this client is burning me out, how can I adequately serve everyone else? Because now I don't have a lot left to give. Great point, Marlo.
I think that's such a huge point, and something that like you said, we as therapists aren't taught that in school. And because, you know, and so many times I've worked with clients who've seen other therapists and it wasn't a good fit, and, you know, they choose to go elsewhere. And I talk a lot of times in first sessions, you know, that every therapist isn't the right fit for every client, and that's okay. And if there's times that you know, need to see someone else, I work in a group practice, so if you need to see someone else in the practice or things like that, but we don't as easily do that from the other perspective, where if it's us that's in a position for whatever reasons that this isn't a good or a healthy fit, well, that we just got to keep on keeping on, because that's not fair to the client. But it's not fair to the clients or to ourselves, or like you said, any of our other clients, if we can't truly be there and present and effective in the work that we're doing.
And I think it brings shame. It's like we feel, seeing where other therapists will judge, and you feel shame and guilt because, you know, you may get the consultation comments saying, well, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. And there was actually a post where I really tried to figure out what would I do in that situation. And guys, I don't know. There was a post on one of the groups had a situation where they were working with a client. The therapist was an African-American woman. I don't remember who the client was. And the client said to the African-American woman in therapy, well, you know, I don't like or date Black women because they're unlovable.
Oh, wow.
I'm a Black woman.
Right.
If I'm in if I like, what would I have? Like, I'm thinking to myself, in my mind, I know what I'm saying, but
right. Well, we all know those things in our mind that we're saying.
but I'm like, how would I handle that? And my first thought, it would have been really a shock to me. So I would have to take that moment and sit there. You have to be comfortable with silence sometimes.
Yes.
And to think about how I'm going to respond to this. Take myself out of it. And there were a lot of comments in the thread, all valid points, but this is reflecting of what we're talking about right now, because potentially if that was a thought process, then my thing, okay, I can't work in my mind. I may not be able to service this client, because that's kind of deep. That's deep.
Yeah.
Especially for us African-American women.
Absolutely.
Please share any of your opinions and tell me, what do you think?
I think it's very complicated. And I think that, first of all, I think it would be amazing if you were able to sit there and hold silence, because not everyone would be able to do that. So if you weren't able to do that, I would just like to verify that that's a normal human reaction if you were to react in some way, and that's okay. And that's a thing that a lot of therapists that later would experience shame about. But the bottom line is, most of us are more heightened these days, and it doesn't take as much to activate us. And maybe we're responding in sessions sometimes in a way that we wouldn't want to. It's maybe less controlled because we're all exhausted. So taking that space is good. Other people might have to absolutely react and say, that's not okay to say that to me. I'm a human being first. I'm a therapist second, and then navigate that. And someone else might choose, I need to let this sit with me for a while and maybe get some consult and discuss it at the next session and figure that out.
Now that makes sense. Yeah, absolutely.
And if
that's a tough one, though. That's a tough one.
Oh, that's a hugely tough one. And I think a lot of therapists right now are also struggling with reproductive rights and, attitudes that are being shared, that they feel like you are personally discussing my rights. You want to take my rights away. And I, as a person, can't sit here and validate what you're saying. And so we're getting more and more of these areas that are complex and difficult as people, well, I'm not going to get into the whole commentary. We're going to leave that right there.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's why the consults help, because then you can talk, to other therapists and get, validation of your experience. And I think that helps with shame. And you can get the varieties of different ways one can react to that, how to have conversation with that, what that might, because I do think that, I think that there's this half and half. It's like, we are humans and we can only take so much. And the last 2 years have been rough. And then there's the other half, like the therapist half, where something like that can be used therapeutically to identify, I am a human being.
Yes.
And you're acting as if I'm not. And that might be an issue. When you say something, it can be hurtful. And how do we deal with that in a therapeutic way? How do we deal with that in a kind human way? And that can be used, but like, we don't always have the energy for that.
No, don't always.
And I think there's lines. I think everyone has a line where it's like, that's it. That's the line for me where I will be harming myself if I'm trying.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Did anyone have any closing remarks they want to say before I wrap us up?
Well, I was just going to say to Marla, and to what you had spoke to, the times are changing, and I think racism's always been there, but all of a sudden people feel entitled to say things more than they did in the past. All of a sudden it's right in your office with people not even filtering, and even though we know they're thinking it, they're not we're just haven't been confronted with those things in the same way.
You're right.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for your participation today. I think we're going to continue to have, like I said earlier, more of these types of cases that we're going to be managing. Michelle, as the therapist, I would want to encourage her to document. You met with how many therapists today, and they shared their opinions, and we discussed all the different aspects. And now you are making a treatment decision based on that. And obviously you need to sign that and put it in the chart just for your own protection and also for the client's protection. So there's a documentation of the whole process that went into you making whichever decision you ended up making. So if, a consultation, obviously I love consultation, but I think that's something that in the past, a lot of us would save that for like those really hard cases, but we're getting more and more of these nuances where we need to be reaching out more often and getting consult from our colleagues about how to navigate some of these things that are so very different than what our training was. So I'd like to thank everyone for your insightful thoughts and suggestions today. It's really refreshing to see how case consultation can look when people approach it in a supportive, informative manner, which I feel like we did today. And lastly, if you're looking for a consultation group hosted in a facilitated small group format, please consider joining the Collab Oasis consultation groups. You can get more information at collaboasis.com.
For everyone listening, there are new episodes of the Colleague Down the Hall podcast released every Thursday on all major platforms. Please remember, our work is hard, but it doesn't have to be lonely. Thank you so much for listening to the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. For show notes, links, and downloads, head over to colleaguedownthehall.com, where you'll be able to learn more about getting the clinical support you need and resources to help you work in a supported, sustainable way. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share with your therapy friends and colleagues. Subscribe to the podcast, and if you love this episode, please leave a review.